Hey guys, how's it going? It is your boy, Manga Drew, and I'm just here to do a discussion for the most recent chapters of My Hero Academia Manga Chapter 359, as well as My Hero Academia Manga Chapter 360. And for the most part, I'll probably just be discussing about 360, the most recent chapter, as well as bring up some things that I may have missed or some differences in translations from 359, as well as 360. But for the most part, what we're going to be talking about in this discussion is really what we saw in 360, involving both what is going on with Shigaraki and his confrontation with Mirio, and what is going on with Bakugo and the weakness that he probably found with Shigaraki. So before we go more into the discussion proper, I'd like to go over the differences between the official and unofficial translations for chapters 359 and 360. And one thing that I noticed in the official translation that isn't in the unofficial translation is just a single line of dialogue that indicates that Mirio was going to be in this war or in this fight towards the end of 359. Because in the unofficial translations, you have an individual saying that communication and security managers, you're needed upstairs. But in the official translation, it is stated by an individual that the messenger bodyguard said that he'll be going up top too. This is the indication of Mirio, and this is even confirmed in 360 to be the case, because in 360, Mirio himself refers to himself as a messenger and bodyguard. So it's cool that we got that initial foreshadowing for Mirio to be at the end of this chapter, but something else that I missed in the official translation is the reference to Sky High. Which, if you don't know what Sky High is, it's just a very small niche movie, probably like a cult classic for some people. We're just following, just high school kids trying to be superheroes. Very similar to My Hero Academia in a sense. So it's a cool callback there. And then the next difference is just Shigaraki berating Bakugo in chapter 359, and that in the unofficial translations, he talks about how he's no longer interested in Bakugo, but he is interested in the fact that he is Midoriya's best friend, while in the official translation, what he says is pretty much the same thing, that he still doesn't have an interest in Bakugo, but that Bakugo is the closest individual to Izuku, to Midoriya. So that is just a slight difference. I wouldn't really say that Bakugo is Deku's best friend, but he is most definitely the person closest to Deku than anyone in the class. So it just makes more sense in the official translation for 359. But now going into the differences between the official and unofficial for 360, there is a fair amount of just small changes in between them. Most of them are just different name changes. For example, in the unofficial translation, Nejire's attack is just called Nejire Pike, while in the official translation, it's called Nejire Wave Pike, as well as a difference in translations with Tamaki's move, which in the official translation is titled Vast Hybrid, Octopus Mirage, and Scorpius Toxin, while in the unofficial translation it's called Cornucopia Combination, Octopus Mirage plus Scorpion Toxin. And another minor difference between these translations just comes from the moment where Shigaraki tosses Bakugo into the air using his feet, and that there's a little bit more clarification for what he is saying to Bakugo in this moment, because in the unofficial translation, he brings up the reasoning why it's good that he doesn't have his quirks right now is because he's able to leave a corpse of Bakugo, while in the official translation, he pretty much says the same thing, but he adds that he can keep the corpse intact, which implies that if Shigaraki had his quirks right now, then that there will be very little, if nothing, left of Bakugo after this fight, so at the very least he's going to leave a body, which would be a very definitive indicator that he's the one that killed Bakugo, so that Deku could riot. So yeah, once again, very slight change, but it can change the idea of the perspective, or just give a better understanding of what was actually going on in this chapter. So yeah, the final differences in these chapters between the official and unofficial translations comes from Mirio's dialogue and the dialogue at the end of this chapter pertaining to Bakugo. With Mirio, pretty much what is the same is how Mirio responds to Shigaraki when he says that he wants everything to be destroyed, and that he refers to Shigaraki not having any friends, but what is different is what comes after that line. Because in the unofficial translation, he brings up how when it comes to Shigaraki, that if he had friends, that he would know that there are some things that should never be broken. While in the official translation, he says that there are plenty of things worth keeping around. So the difference comes from the idea that what Shigaraki is fighting for, or what Mirio is saying, is that it's a comparison between something that is objectively broken versus something that may not be as useful or profitable. Where if there is something that is broken, the idea is that Shigaraki or society is broken on its own, while in the case of the official translation, what they could be implying is that society, even though it's not the greatest, is not something that they should get rid of, while if something is broken, most likely than not, you should get rid of it. So it's just a slight difference in interpretations of what you would think that they are saying in this scene, but pretty much what they are saying in this moment is that if Shigaraki had a friend, then he wouldn't really be going down this path. And this is probably going to be one of the discussion points in this chapter pertaining to Shigaraki and whether or not he actually had friends in the story. But before we get to that, I'd like to bring up the last difference between the official and unofficial translations, and it comes from the last lines of this chapter, which is pretty much pertaining to the idea that Bakugo hasn't given up at all, but the official translation says that despite everything, he's still, implying that, yeah, he's still fighting, but never specifically stating it, while in the unofficial translation, they specifically say that he is a man that isn't finished and that he hasn't given up yet, which is also true, but is not explicitly stated in the manga. So yeah, Bakugo and what's going on with him is going to be another discussion point that I really want to talk about in this video. But let's go back to this idea about Shigaraki and whether or not he actually has friends and whether or not what Muriel said to him is very accurate. Because we have to remember, this line is coming from Muriel, who has really nothing or no knowledge of what Shigaraki has gone through, but is implying that if Shigaraki actually had friends, then he wouldn't be going down this same path. And I think that what Muriel is saying is both correct and incorrect. Because it is correct in assuming that Shigaraki doesn't have friends by his action, but we've seen through the story that he somewhat has friends or is very friendly with the individuals of the League of Villains. Now, here's the thing that we also have to realize. Even though we are making the assumption that Shigaraki does care for the League of Villains, that does not necessarily mean that they are friends. Because in the story, Shigaraki himself has never referred to the League of Villains as actually being his friends or even his family, but that they are allies or comrades in arms. And we've seen with characters such as Redestro, who has a strong care and love for the people around him, he may not necessarily consider them friends because in a way they are dispendable. And this really applies to Skeptic in this way because he doesn't really care about the League of Villains at all, but he does care about what they can do for the wider world and the wider cause. And this could be the main thing that is going on with Shigaraki, that he doesn't necessarily consider the League of Villains his friends or family, but he does perceive them as being important to what he wants to accomplish, and that alone gives him the ability to care for them in a way. And we also have to realize that this is something that has happened with Shigaraki. His wanting to destroy society is something that was brought up at a very young age. And from what we've seen with his backstory as well as his interactions with All For One, he really didn't have any friends. So the idea that he does have friends can be seen with the League of Villains, but it isn't explicitly stated to be the case. But it's also not hard to assume that he doesn't have friends based off the knowledge that we have of Shigaraki and how he was raised by All For One. And how he had a family, but he didn't really have anyone besides his family, even his surrogate father figure, that he could really consider friends until the League of Villains. Now, this does not mean that the members of the League of Villains don't consider Shigaraki a friend. Specifically, Spinner and Twice most likely than not considered Shigaraki a friend, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Shigaraki considered them friends in the same way. At the very least, from what we know, Shigaraki views the League of Villain members as his comrades, and because of that, anything that they want, he's willing to give to them on the grounds that they are comrades and not necessarily friends. So yeah, that's just my idea on how to interpret what Muriel is saying, and that yes, you could imply that Shigaraki does have friends, but you can also imply that he does not, and both sides are in a way correct, and that there's going to be more elaboration on this hopefully in the next chapter, where Shigaraki may finally confirm that yes, I only viewed the League of Villains as being comrades, but over time I viewed them as friends and family. And that this could be the building blocks to eventually lead to Shigaraki changing face and coming to a realization that, hey, I finally found people that I care about, I guess I don't want to destroy anything anymore. And that this could be also built upon Deku trying to save him and being his first true friend as well. So yeah, that's an idea that I have involving Shigaraki and his involvement with being friends and the context of what Muriel is saying. And then going back on a different context that will still involve Shigaraki, let's talk a little bit more about Bakugo. And there are two things I really want to talk about with Bakugo. What role he's going to be playing in this fight when it comes to discovering Shigaraki's weakness, and whether or not the last panel of this chapter is a form of Quirk Awakening. And from my perspective, I think that it is a possibility that this is a Quirk Awakening, because we do see that the sweat that is dripping off Shigaraki is beginning to explode, which means that he is using his quirk at this moment, either directly or indirectly, and that this isn't something that we've actually seen of Bakugo before. Most of the time when we've seen that he's able to use his explosions, he's able to use it through the palm of his hands. But we do know that inherently, when it comes to his sweat, it is inherently explosive because of the type of compound his sweat is made of, which is made of like glycerin or explosive material that he can detonate on his own. So you could equate that because the explosions are coming off the sweat of his face, that is just something that is inherent to his quirk ability from base, or that this is a start of his quirk beginning to evolve, and that his explosions just from his face or just from the sweat coming off of his face are going to be base level significantly stronger than what the explosions were prior. So it is a possibility that Bakugo in this moment may be going through a form of Quirk Awakening, but most likely than not, I would argue that his Quirk Awakening already happened when he learned about how to compress his explosions into more versatile attacks through Cluster. And we already know that he was already able to improve the power and the speed of his attacks through Endeavor, but that his Cluster is completely on a different level. So when it comes to Bakugo's Quirk Awakening, I believe that Cluster is a better representation of what his Quirk Awakening is instead of what we're seeing in this panel. And it's mainly because how he was able to obtain Cluster is very similar to how we've seen characters such as Toga and Geddon achieve their Quirk Awakenings. And that when it comes to a Quirk Awakening, it's pretty much just an upgrade of the initial quirk, or the added factor that would make the quirk stronger. For instance, Toga's Quirk Awakening was her eating blood and turning into the people that she loves, but using the person's quirk as they would. And with Geddon, he was just able to control and manipulate ice, but with his Quirk Awakening, he was able to change the temperature of whatever ice he had so that he can make more ice. And with Bakugo, you could argue that his Cluster is a Quirk Awakening because prior, he was only able to make explosions within a certain range, but because of his Quirk Awakening, he gained a new ability of being able to do multiple explosions out of just a single sweat droplet, or be able to do multiple explosions at the same time, something that he was unable to really do prior. So it's easy to assume that potentially that is his Quirk Awakening, even if it isn't officially confirmed. And without the way, let's talk about what Bakugo saw with Shigaraki with his right hand, because this is something that I addressed in the review, and I think I'm going to go a little bit more in depth into it, because in this chapter, we see that Bakugo is remembering Shigaraki and is saying right finger or right hand. And this is most likely pertaining to the idea that he noticed that there was something wrong with Shigaraki's right hand when Shigaraki was holding him by the throat right before Nejire came and attacked. And that the idea that Bakugo had in that moment was not necessarily seeing that Nejire was coming to his rescue, but that most likely than not, it was him noticing that there was something going on with Shigaraki's hand. And the idea that I have is that I do believe that something is going on with Shigaraki's right hand, because we saw it in chapter 344 of it twitching and hesitate to use DK. And my idea is that this is Tenko. This is the original Tomura Shigaraki, the child version of him, Tenko, trying to fight against All for One and trying to, in a way, prevent himself from doing any more damage. Because at this moment in time, he does not have access to any of his quirks, and the quirks that he would need access to, his most dangerous would be Decay. So what I believe is going to be going on is that when it comes to his right arm, I believe that it is under the control of Tenko, and that the rest of his body is controlled by All for One as well as Tomura Shigaraki, so they will be trying to do everything else, but that Tenko will be residing in Shigaraki's right hand, and then whenever Shigaraki tries to use Decay or tries to attack someone, and Shigaraki would try to steal One for All from Deku, but he will use his right hand, but right before he touches him, it will stop and prevent him from doing it. So what I think is happening is that Bakugo is noticing that something is going on with Shigaraki's right arm, and that he's going to notice it, he's going to find out how to use it to the hero's advantage, and that he's going to eventually report this to Deku so that Deku can take advantage of that and eventually put it into Shigaraki, either through killing him or through saving him. So I think that even though Bakugo isn't going to really have this big bombastic fight, we're going to get something that Bakugo is very good at, being very observant and using the information that he's able to observe to really indicate a best course of action. Because when it comes to Bakugo, what is important isn't just the power of his quirk, but the power of his mind, and how he may be, in a sense, more analytical than Deku, just by Bakugo being Bakugo, and that this is going to be his contribution to finally taking down Shigaraki. So yeah, this is all I really wanted to discuss in this video, so hopefully you enjoyed this video, hopefully you enjoy my content, and what do you think? Do you think that Bakugo will have a bigger role in the story moving forward, or do you think that it's going to be dedicated to him using his mind to try and stop Shigaraki? And let me ask you, do you think that we're going to get more content with Muriel in the next few chapters? I believe that we're still going to be continuing on this fight by how this chapter left off, but we're eventually going to be switching over to another battlefield later, or we're going to see Deku arrive at this location a lot sooner than we anticipated. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video, hopefully you'll leave a comment to my questions, hopefully you'll leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, and hopefully you will subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content like this. Do all that cool jazz, and hopefully I'll be able to catch you in my next video. Goodbye!